Okay, let's go ahead and begin, everybody. And like always, let's just start by just taking a sort of quiet ourselves and enter into that place of silence deep within in the depths of our heart, where the Spirit is always there, sort of brooding over the waters, so to speak, making Christ present to us. And just recollect yourselves. The term just really means focusing all your attention kind of inward, just to be there in the presence of the Lord. And just rest with Him for a moment in that silence and that solitude, just you and He. Almighty and ever-living God, we ask you, Lord, just as you created the world at the beginning with your word and your Spirit, to continually recreate and renew us from within each day as well, Lord. Continue to pour forth that same Spirit upon us to make us into your new creation. Continue to speak that word so that it resounds through us as we become conformed more and more to the image of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Never let us forget the cross, Lord, as the means by which we will ascend to heaven, and help each of us to grow in that holiness that is nothing more than to learn to love you above all things and our neighbor as ourselves. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus the Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So last week we almost finished on the parable of, or the beatitude of blessed are those who mourn. Today, just to kind of look where we're at and where we've been. The first 5 beatitudes, we're on the third one. We'll get to the fourth one soon. We'll probably get to number 5. We should by today. As I've been mentioning before, there's a progression as we move along and grow in holiness and cooperate with God's grace more and more. All of these, remember, require the grace of God to do. None of these can be done by our own power or initiative. And so we start in poverty of spirit, which is really emptying yourself to let God in. From there, we enter into meekness or gentleness, where we adopt Jesus's, which is really God's gentle manner of how we approach people, of how we deal with others and ourselves. We're now looking at mourning, which specifically we're looking at from the angle of embracing the cross, because although it seems paradoxical to us, that's the way that we experience real joy, both in this life and the cause to pass us over into eternal life. Then we'll take up the beatitude on hunger and thirsting for righteousness, where we see now we're to put into effect the kingdom's principles here on earth, each in our own way as much as we're able to, in cooperation with the Son of God, sort of the mission and ministry of the church. And that'll lead us ultimately from justice to mercy, which is a share in God's own life and how we approach others in forgiveness and in giving and things like that. And so the promises, already by emptying yourself and entering into that humility and such, the kingdom of heaven is theirs. That's already the one that's a present tense. All the other ones tell us something that we begin to experience the beginnings of now in their blessings, but which really the fullness of we experience only when the kingdom comes. The inheritance of this world now transformed what it was meant to be, like Eden. The comfort that only the Lord can give us. The satisfaction, which is really that complete fulfillment of all that we were created for and desire, the mercy that we receive from God, and so on as we continue throughout the Beatitudes after we complete these ones. But so we have this progression as we're moving forward. So just to say a few more things about mourning, we ended on the one with mourning, and what the Pope wants to make clear over and over again is to remind us of the fact that there is no salvation apart from the cross. And on page 12, I gave you several bullet points of different, just some example passages of that, but all of them pointing to that same idea of the importance of the cross, of working the way of the cross, what Jesus refers to as the constricted road and the narrow way to enter into heaven. there's an interesting thing here too, that discipline actually is something that helps lead us to joy and peace. In other words, law is done correctly, as God reveals law actually leads to love. It's a way to protect us, to keep us within boundaries, to keep us safe and secure. It's interesting, the way that the modern day Jewish authors talk about the same idea is, for Christians, we're out to restore Eden, and that's very much from Judaism as well. But what Judaism refers to it now is, you might have heard the term in Hebrew, it's interesting, it's tzimtzum, and it means broken shards, because it's the idea that the light of the world on the day 6 was shattered by human sin. And now it's the duty of Israel to go forth and gather all those shards back together and place them back into the light that's meant to shine for all mankind. So that's the Hasidic way, but it's the same basic idea that we're here to rebuild, to sort of recreate, to work with God and cooperate in his recreation of this world and transformation of it. Now, some of the last things the Pope says near the bottom of page 12, after all those bullet points, is he mentions that it's suffering that makes us real. Only suffering can stimulate the birth and growth of humility, forgiveness, faith, and compassion. Right? Once you've experienced compassion, once you've undergone suffering, you have that empathy that goes along with that you can treat other people correctly, that you know how it feels. You're coming from it from a personal angle. In other words, the mournful person, in a sense, lives in reality. Just like I mentioned way back in number 1, that the word for humble means from the ground. It's a person who's grounded in reality, knowing who God is, knowing who they are. In the same way, the person who suffered kind of has entered into the reality of our human condition as it is fallen, but also having done so in light of the cross and the resurrection. So the Pope, at the bottom page 12, and carrying over this statement he makes, he says, the mournful person is, quote, a person who sees things as they truly are and sympathizes with pain and sorrow is capable of touching life's depths and finding authentic happiness. He or she is consoled not by the world, but by Jesus. Such persons are unafraid to share in the suffering of others. They do not flee from painful situations. They discover the meaning of life by coming to the aid of those who suffer, understanding their anguish and bringing relief. They sense that the other is flesh of our flesh and are not afraid to draw near, even to touch their wounds. They feel compassion for others in such a way that all distance vanishes. So the whole idea of the mourners are ones who break that distance. In other words, they enter into communion with one another because our pain and our suffering, our common shared sort of misery in this fallen world is impetus to bring us closer together and recognize our common destiny, our common humanity, our common childhood in God. The Pope then says, though, that the difficulty is that even many Christians have bought into the world's lie about the good life, which he defines, quote, consists of entertainment, pleasure, diversion, and escape. And they simultaneously live in denial about the suffering in the world, which can only be maintained by an immense expenditure of emotional energy, quote, fleeing from situations of suffering in the belief that reality can be concealed. But in reality, what actually happens is the more we try to avoid suffering, the more painful it is when it finally breaks through, because it will. It's just inevitable. And so to deny it, to hide from it, to sort of pretend it's not going to happen or it's not happening is only to kind of set ourselves up for more suffering in the end. And the Pope flat out says, a life just based on entertainment, diversion, pleasure, and escape is meaningless. Possesses no real depth, and it's incapable of true joy, because instead of choosing the real thing that will satisfy us, that will, give us all this comfort and joy, we choose for these limited, finite, temporary things that might give us a momentary relief, but can do no more than that at the best. And sometimes they in turn not only don't give us momentary relief, they become new masters that enslave us in new ways. And so he says the Christian is commanded by the Lord to face reality as it is head on and find true happiness, which comes from, quote, embracing the sufferings of others and engaging in their painful circumstances. Mourning with others is a manifestation of real compassion. That's what the word literally means. Passio means to suffer, who suffers with others. In other words, they're like Jesus, who entered into our fallen and broken world with all its struggles and temptations and just went right into it, to the depths of where human need and sorrow called him. And so compassion, unlike the drive for the so-called good life, never destroys others, but unites people more in intimate bonds of love, making us more human and thus more Christ-like. Because being made in the image of God, the more we actually are true to that image, the more we're like and resemble Christ, the Son of God made flesh. And so as always, the Pope ends with his little one-liner, knowing how to mourn with others, that is holiness. So Beverly.
I've missed some classes, so you may have answered this, but would compassion even exist if we didn't have suffering?
Probably not to some extent. I can't answer.
How could it?
Yeah, it couldn't really.
So we have a world without compassion.
To some extent. I know in the Divine Mercy revelation of Faustina, God reveals that even if humanity had not fallen, God's mercy would still be what undergirded everything, because there's nothing that requires God to lift finite, limited, even if it's not suffering, it's still incomplete, it's still impartial, it's not to its full measure. So that even in that situation, it's still God's mercy that brings human beings into the divine life, that enables them to share that. So at least from the divine point of view, everything's still merciful, everything's still gift. Human beings with each other, I don't know how I'd answer that, to be honest. That's too deep a question.
If there were no suffering, there would be no need for compassion.
Right.
Because compassion is suffering with.
Right.
So it becomes needless.
It would still be love,
Yeah.
but love as we experience it in this fallen world is primarily compassion, or at least a large part of it. And between us and God, it's almost entirely compassion. Because that's the only kind of love we can sort of receive from him at this point because of our brokenness.
That's when I try to mourn with someone who's suffering. Is, I know it's not, this is really good if you say, oh, builds character, but
Yeah.
everybody will say, oh yeah, I would like to be more compassionate. And so it's the reason why we suffer, why a young child suffers, so we can learn compassion.
Yes. Yeah. It teaches us.
The other thing too is this is where the feeling confusion can seep in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like this, therefore I'm not compassionate. That is not true. I think that's the error that's made as we make this statement. I would like to be more compassionate. Compassion is an action, not a feeling.
Right.
So you can feel like crap doing it. But if you're feeling
Everything, and they don't think of themselves as like a compassionate person because they're not an emotional quote person.
Yeah.
But when you see how they act to help others and everything else, I tell them, like, you're more compassionate than I am, believe me. So because they're actually living it and acting it out. So yeah, exactly. And we're going to talk about that when we're coming here too, because you have to recall, whenever you see the word love, and in today's reading, hate in the gospel, those are not primarily or even almost ever emotional terms in the Bible. Terms for that are things like devotion and stuff. The term in the Bible, love, means to serve or to do your duty towards. Hate means something that you're refusing to do your to serve. They're action words. And so, as we hunger and thirst for righteousness, and we hear all these statements of Jesus about love and hate and such, he's not talking about emotional components primarily. Now, having said that, the truth of the matter is, the more the Spirit does guide us, the more that we are conformed to Christ, then our emotional response will, for most of us, begin to align with our actions. But we're in our fallen state, we're disintegrated to an extent. We're not all in unity. But it's not required. But I always point that out because we have to be careful on the other thing as well, because we always talk about love as just being a decision and things like that. And that's true. But if that's all it ever is, if you can never begin to add the emotional devotion or concern to it, then it's just going to become a heartless duty, right? And I mean, sometimes that may be all you have, maybe because of the relationship with the person or whatever it is, but that shouldn't be sort of the model. In other words, we do it with a will, but that will should also be sort of a joy and a desire to help. But like I said, that's going to differ because, we're not even we're in process of being healed ourselves right now, of being reintegrated, our body, soul, mind, emotions. And so at times that's not going to be the case. So we always have to use the gospel standard to guide us. Well, what do I do? Because I don't feel this way, or I don't like this thing. That's why it's so important to have, both. In the case of Catholicism, we believe both that the Spirit is in us, which already sort of aligns with our conscience and heart and already begins to guide us and point us towards the right thing. But because there's still so much inside of us that rebels and fights and, uses every excuse it can to twist it, that's why we also given the gift of the external church with its infallible teachings and things like that. So when my inside conscience and stuff is sort of going wherever it wants to, and I'm sort of, telling myself it's okay to do or not do this, I have this external guide that God promises, will be authentic. Not that the people who teach it will be, not that they'll be holy, but the teaching itself is trustworthy and I can follow that. But of course, the more mature we become, and the perfect thing in this world is when that melts, right? When I will what the church wills, which is all what God wills. But sometimes it's not quite so simple on, in our fallen status right now in healing process. Anything else about these Beatitudes so far? Yeah.
I just want to add one thing here. This problem of not feeling like helping the person while you're helping them, I think it's helpful to remember that love of neighbor is a subset, if you will, of love of God.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have that feeling towards the person, remember why you're doing it, which addresses what Chris said, which is very important, that it just becomes an act without any love. It's a discipline.
Right.
That you're doing it because you love God.
Right.
And if you don't like the person, you still love the Creator. And when you love the Creator who created the person you're helping, this sometimes is a pathway to work through that difficulty.
Yeah. I remember, you guys know Father Kiefer,
Yeah.
and when we all went down to the soup kitchen once and did stuff, I wasn't in high school, I was older, but he told the high school kids going with us, he said, no matter what happens today, you're going to have a blessed day. Because either you're going to come into contact with people there who have absolutely nothing, whose lives are a mess, and the love and the kindness and stuff they show you will so humble you to realize, God's love and such, that it'll be a blessing. Some of you will come across the people who are angry and bitter because life screwed them and they are not happy and they are not going to be thankful to you. He says, it would be nice if all poor people, served us and gave us appreciation and came back and, ate with their knife and fork and their nice. He says, but that teaches you too, because you're not doing it to get a good feeling. You're doing it because this is what God asks we do to one another. And so it was clear, that idea that, what we're doing is for the Lord. And, we're going to talk about, it's interesting because that'll come up in a lot of ways, because when we get to mercy, because we've talked so much by that time, and Pope has already mentioned so much the deeds of mercy, he's going to focus most of his reflection on mercy in terms of our forgiveness of others and just that kind of thing. But when it comes to forgiving others, when it comes to loving enemies, for the same reason, similarly to what Deacon John just said, we're commanded to do those because by doing them, we imitate God. We're not commanded to do them because the person is worthy of it or deserving of forgiveness. That's not the reason. Jesus always tells us, because your heavenly Father does this. And so it's so we get out of our game of, trying to figure out who can benefit and who can't from my mercy based on the standard I have of who's deserving or not. It takes us out of that entirely. To forgive others, as we'll see in mercy, doesn't mean that I think what they did to me is okay. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not all the excuses we use to sort of avoid having to do it. It's to be like God and to free myself, And similarly with love and such, loving enemies. Well, I can't love this enemy because they've done such bad things. Yes, they have, and no one denies that. No one's pretending it didn't happen. Anyway, I'll save it. Or I might as well jump to that one now. Okay, so moving from embracing the cross now, the Pope now moves to hunger and thirsting for righteousness. And he points out that sort of once we've embraced the cross, we're kind of impelled or compelled by the Spirit to sort of directly begin to struggle for that cause of justice. That's what righteousness means. It's just the word for justice. In Luke's version, it's always more concrete and visceral. It's just, blessed are you who are hungry, for you will be satisfied. In Luke, he points out that Luke's 4 Beatitudes, Luke only has 4, they're all the same person, because the poor are who are hungry, are who are. But the important part is what Francis does here, Pope Francis, is he kind of takes Luke and Matthew, and he sort of combines them to an extent in his brief overview here. At the bottom of page 13, he says, hunger and thirst are intense experiences, since they involve basic needs and our instinct for survival. There are those who desire justice and yearn for righteousness with similar intensity. Jesus says they will be satisfied, for sooner or later, justice will come. We can cooperate to make that possible, even if we may not always see the fruit of our efforts. What the Pope begins to get to now is sort of the larger mission of the Church. Now, there are kind of 2 ways we could look at this part. I'll erase the earlier ones here. The hunger and thirst for righteousness really has sort of 2 components to it. One component is sort of my personal piety. That is, do I personally carry out the works of mercy in some way, and how? On a one-on-one level, to this person, to this family member, to this coworker, to this person I see. But the Pope wants to remind us too that there's a larger one, and that is we have to involve ourselves in the struggle for justice in the world. Right, when Jesus commissions the apostles to go out and to evangelize, it's also to begin to change whole structures and whole sinful situations and ways of doing things. In other words, it's not only to struggle against the flesh, that's our personal, selfishness and weaknesses that constantly are trying to, fall back into the way of this life of sin. In this one, it's justice for the world God created, as opposed to in opposition or in combat with the world that lies under the authority of the evil one. Where human sin becomes institutionalized, becomes entire structures are based on prejudices and evils and greed and different things. And so we're not only meant to combat in our own lives, but we're to go forward as a church, and also sort of stand up to the issues of the world. And what's interesting here is in looking at this, the Pope really brings us back to something about Jesus. And I want to, something that when scholars have looked, and this is something that's been a huge thing in both Protestant and Catholic Christologies, that is the study of Jesus, over the last 60, 70 years especially. And that is when we see Jesus' statements and what he's doing, and we look back to the Old Testament, what is it, like what is the theme, what are the things that drive the Lord himself in his own mission and teaching? And what's come to be the consensus among both Catholic and Protestant scholars is that Jesus is driven that the kingdom of God is to be an everlasting jubilee. Now we need to know what a jubilee is. As Catholics, we've heard the term because every once in a while a pope will proclaim some jubilee about something. But what was the jubilee itself? And for this, we'll look at Leviticus 25. And so if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Leviticus 25. And we begin to see where Jesus' kind of mindset is as he goes forth and he's asking people to do these different things. In chapter 25, the first 7 verses have to do with what's called the sabbatical year. So notice, one of the things that Israel did under the inspiration of the Spirit is it seeks to sanctify time. Right? As Catholics, we do that as well. That's the whole liturgical calendar. And it follows through all the patterns, beginning not too far away at Advent, leading up to Christmas, the Incarnation, and looking at the teachings of Jesus, all these saints in between who are part of this family of faith, leading ultimately to the preparation in Lent for his suffering, death, and resurrection, Easter, and so on and so forth. So what happens is similar. So the Jews had a weekly sanctification, right? Every 7th day, Sabbath. And that was a day of rest for all creatures. And it's clear, it's all creatures, not just human beings, all your animals, your slaves, everyone. Well, now these first 7 verses, or 8 verses, 7 verses, this is a sabbatical year. So it had a sanctified every 7th year. And every 7th year, it was for the land. The land had to be let to remain fallow. It could not be harvested, planted, anything. So in years 5 or 6, it was incumbent upon the community to begin to save up for that year, that the whole year would go for them to pass beyond it. And then, of course, you'd have like the yearly different celebrations that would go on. But there was also this Jubilee. And the Jubilee year was every 49th/50th year. So every Sabbath of Sabbaths, so to speak. And the Jubilee year was huge. You can see it takes up from verse 8 all the way to the end of the chapter. 55 verses. But without having to read it all, what happened in the Jubilee year? Well, like a sabbatical year, the land would have to lie fallow. Secondly, all slaves and prisoners automatically freed. Now, you didn't have to worry about violent criminals being freed because they were already dead or maimed in those days. So most people were there for offenses against economic interests. That's why most people were slaves. Couldn't pay your debt, you became enslaved. So the manumission of all slaves and prisoners, all debts were forgiven, period. Slate wiped clean for everyone.
This only applies to Jews, right?
Well, yeah, it applied to anyone in the Holy Land who, like resident aliens, things like that. Number 3, and number 4, a huge one, is all land had to be returned to the ancestral/clan/family that owned it originally.
How could you ever get ahead?
You weren't supposed to. What it wanted to do is it wanted to sort of reset stuff at the end so that, first of all, the whole world belongs to God, but he specifically designates the land of Israel to belong to the tribes. And then the whole story of Joshua and that is they separate each of the sections of the Holy Land into that tribe. And then each tribe, their clans would settle in there. And so it was a way to keep all of the clans sort of united, all of the people, the tribal things equal, sort of before God. So if one had lots of damaging things done, then that would revert back. So and also, I mean, to be honest, by the 50th year, you're almost talking a generation and a half. Most of the people who began that are long dead in those days.
So that happened every 50 years?
Every 50 years. In fact, one of the reasons why God judges Jerusalem is when they cease to keep the Jubilee. And that'll result in the thing. Anyway.
That's not currently still done, the Jubilee in Israel, is it?
It can't be, because Israel's a secular country. The Hasidic Jews try, but no, it's not done anymore. And it's interesting. I mean, not to get into political, religious things, but both the conservative or the Orthodox Jews and the Hasidic Jews, they both constantly warn that Israel's going to fail again because it's still living like a secular nation and it's not obeying its laws. Whenever the Hasidics get in power, things change drastically. Driving is not allowed on the freeways during that time period. You know, they're a parliamentary system, so it's all. But anyway, no. In general, the Jubilee year is not enforced in any way. And what would begin the Jubilee year would always be the Day of Atonement. That's what the first verses tell us. On the 10th day, let the ram's horn sign. This is the Day of Atonement. So it would begin with the forgiveness of all what we would say today in our Catholic terms, mortal sin. If you have Jewish friends today who at least even slightly practice their faith, you'll know that Yom Kippur is a huge holiday, right? They go out of the way to make apologies, they call people, they do all kinds of things. Because the way that Israel's sacrificial system was set up is in the temple or the tabernacle, there were 5 sacrifices. But all of those sacrifices dealt with either voluntary offerings, so they weren't a sacrifice for sin, but they were something you chose to do to acknowledge a blessing, right? That votive candles, votive offerings, that's where the whole idea comes from. It's giving thanks for something. The other ones were for what we would call, Jews didn't refer to these terms, they were for the forgiveness of venial sins and inadvertent sins. When you discovered later you had sinned, you were required to go and take care of that. What was missing, however, is what they called sins done with a high hand. That's the phrase in Hebrew. And it comes from the image of Adam and Eve reaching up to grab the forbidden fruit with a high hand. Those are sins that are serious breaking of the Torah and are done with, basically the same idea that Catholics use today, done with knowledge and consent. Those sins could only be forgiven once a year on this day. And so this was a huge day. And so for that Jubilee year, 49, 50th, the reason I say that is scholars are unclear. Different translations, scholars have translated the Bible differently. Some say it refers to the 49th year as the actual Jubilee. Some say, no, it's the 50th, the one right after the Sabbath. Whatever it was, it started with this huge communal forgiveness of sins for all Israel. And then the Sabbath would begin to be, the Jubilee would begin to be lived. Now, when we get to Jesus and we look at his teachings and what he asks people and what he tells them, what we see, scholars tell us, and I think it becomes more clear the more you look at it, is that Jesus proclaimed the kingdom as being an everlasting Jubilee. In other words, remember his first statement of who he is at Nazareth. What does he come to do? To free the prisoners, to proclaim the year acceptable to the Lord, to all these things. That's the Jubilee year, right? It's the book of Isaiah, but it's quoting Leviticus 25 that he's coming from. And notice the forgiveness of sins, all the things that go into Jesus' statement. So the Pope, drawing on all this statement for us, he tells us that this hunger and thirsting for justice, the point of view isn't whether we keep the Jubilee exactly as Israel did, but do we realize that the Jubilee year was something that was meant to change the entire society? It wasn't just one-on-one. And what the Pope wants us to realize is our mission is not just one-on-one, to do good deeds for a few people throughout our life. That's true, but we also have a commitment, as all Israel did, as an entire church, to see that justice, not necessarily the exact way the Jubilee was lived in its time, but that real justice based on Catholic social principles is brought to bear in as much as we can, in our own efforts and work. If I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it applies good. If you have the original document, the handout I gave you guys, number 99, which actually is in the next section, but it speaks to this same idea. Number 99 in the actual letter. He says, for Christians, this involves a constant and healthy unease. He's talking about the service of others. This is paragraph 99 of the original document. Even if helping one person alone could justify all our efforts, it would not be enough. Instead, the biblical understanding the Jubilee year was about more than simply performing good works. It also meant seeking social change. For later generations to also be released, clearly the goal had to be the restoration of just social and economic systems so there could no longer be exclusion. For us in America, that means you better be registered to vote and vote Catholic principles. I mean, at the most basic thing, at least. And it might go beyond that, based on what your call is and how God reveals himself of your mission in his life. But the point that the Pope is making is he wants us to broaden expand our understanding beyond just me. But how do I bring this justice as much as I can, knowing this world is fallen, and knowing I will not be the one to ultimately bring about justice. Even the whole human race together, the church can't achieve that. God will do that. But it's sort of the interesting thing. We are called upon to still fight for social justice. It's a necessity, but we won't ever accomplish it by our own power, even with the grace of the Spirit. It's going to ultimately be God who brings it all about. Or another way to say it is to remember we're responsible for our faithful acts. We are not responsible for the results because we can't control that. All we can do is answer the call that God has shown us in bringing, hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And I do what I do, whether it achieves what I wanted, maybe it will, oftentimes it won't. Or as the statement, I think it's St. Therese of Lisieux, it might be St. Teresa, Mother Teresa, but we're called to be faithful, not successful. And in fact, in this beatitude especially, this is one the Pope tells us you will fail at. He doesn't mean fail at because you don't try to do it. That's true too. He means this is the one you're going to see the most failure in terms of it didn't achieve anything you hoped. It didn't accomplish it. But because of the hope and the understanding of what God is doing, you nevertheless continue to pursue it. You keep that as part of your understanding. Now, the very last line he has, which is really the top of page 14, he says, we can cooperate to make that possible, even if we may not always see the fruit of our efforts. So I just talked about the second half. This is the one that we won't often see the fruit of our efforts, or at least not as glorious as we'd like it to be. And a lot of times we're going to see everything, the tide seem to be going against us. But we still maintain that hope, that understanding, the trust in the Lord. The first part, the first half of the sentence is interesting because the Pope kind of leaves it open-ended on purpose. We can cooperate to make this possible. Two ways. The first one, which is very important, is our first cooperation has to remember to be with God. Just so we keep reminding ourselves time and time again, the Pope, we're not social workers, right? We're not just to go out and start to try to do things by our own efforts, by our own desires, by our own will and power. We'll fail. No, we're supposed to cooperate with the grace of the Holy Spirit, armed with sort of Christ and his love for others, knowledgeable about what the church teaches as the gospel reveals about issues of social justice, but it has to be always undergirded by God, done in God, with God, letting God lead. The moment, especially in this one, the moment we start to get ahead, then we fall into all kinds of problems. Either we fail utterly or we go in directions that can be problematic. And that kind of goes to the second one. The second thing of cooperation, we have to cooperate, is that we also have to cooperate. It's a phrase that in official Catholic documents that's become more and more widespread since the time of John the 23rd. We have to cooperate with all people of goodwill. So on a specific issue, if some other group is aligned with the same goal as Catholic social teaching, well, can we work with them? Yes, in fact, we're supposed to work with them. Now, of course, this always requires discernment. There are some groups that may have the same goal in mind, but they may do so in a way that's so disconnected or opposed to the way the gospel understands the dignity of human persons or other issues that it would cause a problem. So, you have to intelligently approach it, but in a general sense, if people are willing to help, even if they're not Catholic or even Christian, then of course we mobilize people to help in whatever these issues are. An example of one, that required discernment that the church has kind of made for us is, for example, you can't really, as Catholics, we don't have the permission to cooperate with, say, communism. Because communism on the surface may be approaching some of the same goals it looks like, but when you really understand it, and the very fact that it understands the church itself as one of the dangers that have to be eradicated, well, it would make no sense, because now you're literally arming your enemy against yourself. That was the whole thing you may remember from the 80s of liberation theology in the South America, which is a lot more nuanced than most people understand. In 4 years or 3 years, 2 different documents were released. And the first one came down really hard on liberation theology, on those groups that specifically were aligning themselves with these rebel groups that were funded by communist group parties and countries and such. And the church came down very hard, and there can't be that kind of cooperation, you can't, all these things. But then 2 years later, after reflecting on it, the church still reaffirmed that, right? We can't give away the whole church's identity in operating with groups that are anti the church itself. But it did okay the idea of liberation theology as a necessary fact. That is, it basically said, yes, the church should be hungering and thirsting for justice against evil regimes, against these problematic things. But there are some ways that a Christian can't do that. That being said, though, when it's possible, we should, in whatever it is. The first easiest efforts are look to non-Catholic Christians, and then our Jewish brothers and sisters, and then, you kind of reflect on who can do it. But even people who are, quote, atheist agnostic, if the issue that's arising doesn't necessarily have anything to do with specific freedom of religion or the church and protection of human dignity, well, then even those people can certainly help us. An example of this that's been the case since Paul VI is it's called the Vatican Observatory, which is kind of a funny term because it dates back from a long time ago when the Vatican does have an observatory, but that was sort of the rudiments of science of the time. Today, if you don't know it, the Pope, the Vatican has a council of scientists. Those scientists are handpicked and asked to be on it because they are the best in their field in the world, regardless of their religion. So for example, we have one right here at UCSD who I'm in January for the week of Christian unity. The Catholic Church locally, the Lutheran Church and the Anglicans always get together and they have speakers. And so the thing this year is going to be on ecology and Christian response and such. And so the sort of generic speaker is the Pope scientist, who's here at UCSD. He's graciously come to speak. And then each of the traditions will have, one speaker representing them who talks about their particular Christian traditions, view of ecology, how they've dealt with it, things like that. But he's not Catholic, he's Hindu. But he's the best in the world. So use him, right? Because all he's there for is to help the Vatican, the magisterium, when it makes decisions, when it writes things, when it makes statements of policy for the church and understanding. He's there because of his expertise in that field. His religion is irrelevant at that point. So it just gives an example of how this happens. In the old days, all encyclical letters and things from the Pope were always sort of addressed to a specific Catholic group, oftentimes just the bishops. And then a few popes here and there in earlier years would also address all the faithful. But then beginning with John the 23rd, he would end most of his writings with, and all people of goodwill. And that carried over into John Paul II, almost everything he wrote, and into Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, and now into Francis. And so Francis he doesn't spend a lot of time on it, but he just mentions, these are things that, because of the size of the issues we're facing, these are things where allies are good, right? And we shouldn't, he who's not against me is for me kind of understanding in this place, if we have the same goals. I'll just mention one other thing that I don't have in the handout, but the Catholic Church has a tradition that's referred to in its teaching on sin, of sins that cry to heaven. And the phrase comes from the Bible, that there are certain actions that God himself always answers eventually, because they're in so detrimental to the life of the faith and of the coming of the kingdom. So the peccata clementia. In the modern catechism, our current one, it's number 1867. And there are 5 of them, traditionally. They're all from the Bible. They're all, in every time when they're mentioned, or at least in their main mention, there's always this statement. This cries to heaven, this cries to heaven, or the cry of them went up to heaven. So what are they? And the reason I put this up is this will show us something else about hunger and thirsting for righteousness. One is the sin of Abel. So that's any kind of willful murder. Big ones today, would be abortion, euthanasia, etc. But other things as well. The second one, which is very non-PC today, is the sin of Sodom. Homosexual acts, not orientation, but carrying them out, the acts. The next one is the sin of Egypt. That's slavery, oppression, what they did to Israel. So those who enslave peoples, and there's a lot of ways. I mean, there's the literal way of slavery, but there's a lot of ways peoples can be kind of enslaved in different systems and regimes and such. Oppression, etc. The next one is kind of the one that most of you would be most familiar with, because you often hear it where 3 groups are always called out, that Israel has to prove that it's really of God, unlike the pagans, and God judges it by how they care for widows, orphans, and foreigners. In other words, how do we treat the disenfranchised, the weakest members, the ones who lack power in our societies?
What's a sin? What is that? sin relating back to number 4?
It's a constant, it's
Oh.
kind of the biggest refrain of the 5, it's the
Oh.
one you hear over and over
But
again.
it doesn't have a classification like.
No,
Okay.
I mean, part of it is explained by the fact that Israel itself should know what it's like to be this because of its own history of enslavement. But it comes up a lot, and it's found in Jesus reiterates it again, and that's why there's so many stories about widows in the story with him, and the pagans he comes into contact with who are foreigners, James. And then the last one is the sin of Israel, but I put Israel in quotes because this means not Israel, the whole people, but when the country split into two and there was the north took the name Israel and the south took the name Judah. And the sin of Israel was injustice to the wage earner, fraud, false scales, a way to, basically screw people out of their money. Now, what's interesting about these 5 is when you look at all 5 together, and this is just one part of the church's teaching on sin. I mean, sin's a lot broader than this. But one thing that's interesting about it that helps us in this hunger and thirsting for righteousness is this. We are commanded as Christians to follow the whole gospel of God. That is, we don't pick out our pet sins or injustices that happen to correspond with our socioeconomic political group. Because the first 2 would be considered, in America at least, issues of the right. Sex and abortion. And the last 3 would be considered primarily issues of the left. And yet, God says, that's irrelevant. Right? That can't be your standard. That can't be how you judge what's going on. So I only use these 5 as an example. The real statement is, do we follow what the church teaches? In its fullness, when it talks about human social justice and such. What does the church actually teach? And our standard that's our standard. It's not what my group thinks or what group I belong to. It's the whole thing that I have to look at all of it and try to understand that when I'm implementing both in my personal life, but also to what extent I can on the larger scale, these issues that that we're trying in some way to Christianize the world. And so it's at this point, unlike the other ones where the Pope finally points out how paradoxical this is, that on the surface, we might think the search for justice is one that the world and the church can agree on, but the Pope says, not on your life. He says, the justice of the world isn't true justice. It's, quote, entitlement, favoritism, or naive egalitarianism. So he says, what passes for justice in this world is very far from it. And he quotes he doesn't quote, he gives a statement about Jude. I actually gave you the whole quote here, right in the middle of page 14. But basically what the Pope draws from this, so we don't have to read through the whole thing, is that 2 points. Human justice is always based in sinful partiality, inequality, all human justice. Even if we say or try not to, right? We say justice is blind. It's not. The second thing is we need to recognize that the hallmark of justice is to love your neighbor as yourself. Earlier when Deacon John said, the love of neighbor is like sort of a subset of the love of God. Exactly. In fact, it's the way God himself proves you love him. It's not through your devotional acts primarily, but through your love of neighbor. Some of you went to Mass today, or maybe you read the readings regularly. Paul's letter. All the commandments can be summed up in one. Love your neighbor as yourself, not love of God. That's kind of assumed in a sense for us who are Christians. So, and that's not the only time Paul says it. He says it again in Galatians. John refers to it as the new commandment of love. James calls it the royal law. So this is not a side thing. This is how God himself views it. How do you treat those made in my image and likeness? Right? And the Apostle John kind of gives us he gives us the emphasis, because he sort of calls us to task. He says, those who say they love God but hate their neighbor are liars. Because how can you love something you can't see when you hate something you can see that's from that God? And so don't fool yourself into thinking that, that you, quote, love God, but you don't love neighbor. On a more practical level, I would just say, as practicing Catholics, most of us loving God comes easier, right? You know what to do. You go to Mass, you do your prayers, you try to read scripture, you try to become devotional, sort of attached and devoted to the Lord. But Jesus himself tells us what? If you love me, how will Jesus know? This is an interesting one. Jesus tells us, you'll know you love me if you do what? Keep my commands. And one of my foremost commands is love your neighbor. So if you don't engage in this, you're playing kind of a game with yourself about where your religion lies. And then what James does, although he's jumping ahead on us, but he's sort of pointing forward to what's coming after justice, the merciful, his very last line here in the indented paragraph that's in bold. So speak and act as people who will be judged by the law of freedom. For the judgment is merciless to one who has not shown mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Now, we'll talk about this a lot more in the next beatitude, which we should get to very soon after the break. But one of the things that's to recognize here is, one, James doesn't go into detail here, but he's already alluding to something that's the teaching of Jesus, which is a difficult one, and that is God lets us make our own standard of mercy. Every time we say the Lord's Prayer, we acknowledge that. Forgive me my sins and trespasses as I forgive those. And Jesus will tell us later that's exactly the extent to which God will forgive you. Okay? You make your own standard. And then the last statement can be misunderstood. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Certainly in a generic sense, in the theological sense, God's mercy triumphs. But that's not what James is talking about. He's talking about our judgment and as we're standing before the throne of God. So what he's telling us is, when I show mercy, my mercy will triumph over God's judgment of me. Right? In other words, God takes that into account, and that trumps the evil I've done to an extent. It's not like you just weigh it out, but I've shown by that my heart is really in accord with the Lord, when I'm really coming from a place of mercy. But having looked at this, though, Jesus, we're told, the Pope tells us, Jesus offers a justice other than the world, which is so often marred by petty interests and self-serving partiality. The wealthy, the famous, those of status receive, quote, justice far more often than the poor, the unknown, and the nobodies. I mean, it makes us all uncomfortable. I know that because we're a wealthy society, but it's true. And if you control the courts and the economic system and everything else, it's hard to lose to those who don't have that status. Let me give you a super common example. Law school. If me and LeBron James, do you guys know who LeBron James is? Okay, so it makes sense. I just making sure. Okay, you don't have to know about basketball, but you just know he's one of the greatest who's ever played the game. If he and I get in a car accident, we both lose our right arm, I cannot sue for as much money as he can. He is worth more, even in the eyes of the law, than I am. Both human beings, both lost the same limb, same injury. Why? Because he has a better status. So yeah.
How are you going to type?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, for me it would be terrible, especially with the left. I would, because I'm already.
You can still shoot with the other hand.
That's why. Yeah. But the other thing is, on the very first day of law school, I'll never forget this. I won't tell my professor's name. I don't want to get him in trouble. But first day of law school, my first class was civil procedure. I think I mentioned this before. Talking about the worst class to start a law school study of, because the whole year is just figuring out who has jurisdiction. The national government or the federal government, state, local, maybe even if you throw in an Indian, or an ambassadorship, who gets to hear the case? And on the very first, I say it's horrible because that's where you want to start your law careers, like all just, I think it's so they get rid of you because there's so many of us. They're just trying to let's just get these people out. But my professor was really straightforward. He said, on the very first day, because I'll never forget, it was like my first experience to law, or second experience of law school. But he says, I'm going to teach you all year about the way we pretend that we have this system of checks and balances for people to determine who gets jurisdiction. He goes, but let's all be honest. In the end, it comes down to power. The highest court that wants it will get it no matter what. Right? It will figure out and use the law and create the law if it needs to get what it wants. So, what the Pope is stating isn't that far off. And we're in a country that has a pretty good legal system. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to bash the American legal system. There's ones far worse. But it's in the end, it's still based on power and those who sit in power. They're going to control that law and determine it and everything else. And so what the Pope tells us then is divine justice is of a whole different order. Now, I gave you an enormous handout or enormous quote, and we're not going to read it. But I'll just give you some highlights when we come back, but let me just introduce it first. This long quote, which, like I said, I'm just going to hit some points and tell you it. It goes 2.5 pages. It's from a man named Romano Guardini. Now, Romano Guardini was an Italian man who lived and was born and lived his entire life in Germany because his father was Italy's ambassador to Germany. Now, as Guardini got older, he became this brilliant young theologian who became well known, and he went to teach in the Vatican. I think the Gregorian. And his greatest student, who considers him to have been his sort of mentor his whole life, every idea in here comes from Romano Guardini. So Guardini is a man, and you can still, Sophia Press still sells all his books all these years later, how to prepare to Mass, how to pray. Most of them are very practical. He has one called The Lord, which is still one of the best teaching on Jesus I've ever read. That's where this quote comes from. But what's interesting is Guardini influences Benedict, who puts this forth, and this becomes sort of now a deep reflection that the whole Catholic Church kind of looks at on human justice and divine justice, what Guardini was thinking about way back in the 30s and 40s, before Vatican II was even a glimmer, of how he saw things in the world, how he saw the church at that time, and how he was reading through the Gospels and how that the church had to mesh better with what he saw in there. So when we come back from the break, we'll just hit the highlights. You can go back and read his entire quote later. I recommend his book. It's called The Lord. But let's go ahead and take our break, and then we'll come back.